to change with the down arrows right here, okay? The little clicker's not going to get you, so you just use the down arrow to go to the next one.
Okay.
If you have any trouble, just tell me to change it.
Or it'll click if you just click. No? Well, just click if you click. Oh, no, because we're.
No.
Okay.
Okay, we're going to proceed with our next presentation.
Good to go? Okay, great. I'm Richard Brockway, and I lead up the cybersecurity, information security for, from a mission assurance perspective, the capabilities and functions here at the IV&V program. We've touched on some of these topics over the last couple days, and we're a bit of a captive audience here, somewhat like you feel like you're preaching to the choir at times because maybe even for some of the other topics here, because we all tend to get it, right? We're independent, and we're trying to provide, it's an assurance providing mission. And so some of the topics here that I'll touch on are adapted from some other forums in interfacing with the missions and programs and helping convince them of not only the capabilities but the benefits of our capabilities here in the assurance providing mission and the benefits to their mission. So we'll talk a bit about the who, what, when, where, why, and how, with some focus on the why and the what here early on, with the goal of overviewing, getting confidence in mission security with IV&V information assurance. So much like Martin highlighted earlier, we don't have to dive too deeply into the threat landscape because it's pretty well understood that there's an advanced and very persistent threat. And so, for example, I just did a recent risk assessment. It's one of our independent assessment capabilities here. And just the threat component was 2 pages of 10-point font for a low system, a low impact system. So rather than duplicate that here, or for a monitor high system, it seemed appropriate just to simply put a target on Earth, overlay that against Earth, and say that there's a very much continuously evolving threat. Network connectivity is constantly increasing, very much diverse and distributed attacks, increasing in sophistication and frequency. And why is that? Because NASA, as well as other organizations, have high-value targets. There's something that others want. And indeed, for further inspiration, Congress has provided inspiration in the sense that we have to continually innovate and adapt, or indeed our data systems and operations will continue to be endangered. So what does that mean? Let's not rest on any laurels of say, hey, we haven't had loss of mission, loss of data. In particular instances, there is no perfect system, so given that it's a limit function and the threat is pervasive, let's do everything we can to self-assess and improve our system software and hardware. So in that theme, the IV&V has a Safety and Mission Assurance Support Office, and we have an overarching program mission, and that is to ensure that mission and safety critical software and systems operate reliably and safely. And to fundamentally do that, you need to do that securely as well. And so that dimension is highlighted here, and the support for performing that is we're assisted and reinforced by both NIST and IEEE in the sense that that we need to have and enable techniques for performing information system security control assessment and monitoring, and that is delegated to that independent IV&V assessor role in the risk management framework, as well as throughout IEEE 1012 for system and software V&V. There are security analyses that are called out, and I'll touch on that again later. And why is that? It's to counteract the threat landscape, and to do that, we need to have some techniques deployed throughout the project lifecycle. So further to the why, we've talked a bit about that you should do this because there's a threat, and there are frameworks from NIST and IEEE that you must do this. FISMA tells us that we shall do this, and so the Federal Information Security Management Act, from a government agency perspective, requires agencies to use a risk-based approach to develop, document, and implement a security program to protect the assets, those high-value targets. And the Office of Management and Budget has established those requirements for security of federal automated information systems, and then indeed each agency, and certainly NASA, has agency directives to apply the FISMA framework, OMB directives, presidential directives, and otherwise. And in our case, we have policy directives and policy requirements that then trickle down to our NASA missions, to our NASA infrastructure, and indeed other agencies have that as well. And so this really gets to the heart of why we must, and indeed collectively, must address this. And then it calls or charters the need from an independent perspective to provide assurance to those missions. So we won't go in very, very deeply here, but the whole idea is that you have to address the confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So Martin gave some examples. You've heard some examples in some of the other discussions, but you're wanting to prevent unauthorized disclosure, unauthorized modification, or disruption of access to your information system or to your asset. And so NIST, as well as other organizations, really put this as the basis, and you'll see how this plays into sort of characterizing the system such that then you can perform a risk assessment, select the proper security controls, and indeed determine what your security posture should be and is, and how it should be monitored. So programs and missions, hey, we're secure, got cost and schedule demands, and so it's interesting when you talk about, well, adequate security to some, this can sound very subjective, but it has to be commensurate with the risk of with the magnitude of harm resulting to the loss, misuse, or unauthorized access to the asset. And so and on the surface may seem subjective, but there are techniques that are used in order to hone in on and categorize, well, what is the risk given the asset you're trying to protect? And that will vary. And once that is established, the rest of the journey then can take place. And that journey is indeed where, from an independent assurance providing perspective, where we can help. The second bullet is to then further, and this is coming from OMB as well, is assure that system applications used by a particular agency operate effectively and provide the appropriate confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So one thing that's helpful is continuing to adapt and also become more value added is that information security, there's been a paradigm shift. And so many, I think still today, look at security as a compliance initiative or it's policy based, and indeed there is some history and basis for that view, but the framework has evolved to where it's requires more of a risk-based approach, and it's looking at the protection mechanisms. And so here, instead of going from a clipboard exercise at a snapshot in time of are you compliant with some set of policies, it's evolved more to the missions driving, again, what their assets are trying to protect, the high value targets, what are the business functions. Those drive the associated requirements. Everybody gets on the same page, and then we say, okay, given those assets, we're going to establish what the protection mechanisms are, and then we're going to test to that, we're going to implement to that, and continue to monitor to that. And so this is really good news from the program perspective, but it isn't always still embraced because there's a view that it's a paperwork exercise. Certainly, an ultimate goal is a build it right strategy. So you want to build in security from the get-go. And beyond this being a more of a construction icon here, it's an I-beam, and what's glaringly obvious there is that it's an I. And so what I like to emphasize to the stakeholder community, particularly the program managers, is, well, what can I do in establishing the baseline for security, building security in, and enforcing the developers to deliver a product that meets those security requirements. And then it becomes a win-win proposition as opposed to just simply fighting compliance or seeking waivers to some particular security requirement. So again, looking at it from not being a paperwork exercise, depending on the agencies and its implementation of FSMA, there's certification and accreditation, CNA, or assessment and authorization. And some may still view that as a paperwork exercise, and indeed it's not, and it's not intended to be, because you're looking at the entity or the asset that needs to be protected. What are the security measures specifically that are going to apply to meet those particular security objectives? And then there's an assessment process that's performed through the various life cycles to enable the entity to operate or be put into place or to fly or to interface to other systems. And that assessment is necessary and required through some of, well, both agency directives as well as from a government perspective. And then the authorization component is, given that fact-finding mission, given the context that's been defined by what is the information or asset being protected, what are the security controls that were selected to protect it, were those tested, were those implemented, what are the variances, then a decision is made for that system to either be accredited, authorized to operate. And why is this important is because this is the measure of the security controls effectiveness, but again, not from the clipboard perspective, more so from what assets are you trying to protect. So ensuring that the adequate countermeasures and mitigating factors are in place, operating as intended, and that the risk is understood. And many times the discussion that I'll have is, it's not let's check the box to see if it's been documented. Artifact review many times is considered, it could be considered just looking at a snapshot in time of was particular pieces of information documented. No, it's actually, does the security control exist? Is it securely configured? Indeed, is it documented? And then is it monitored throughout the life cycle of the system in operation? All of that taken collectively is a measure of the effectiveness of the security control to protect a particular asset. So this provides a risk management framework, and this simple diagram represents 100+ pages of what NIST provides to all of us for categorizing the information system, selecting and implementing security controls, assessing those security controls, getting the system authorized, the authority to operate, and then once it goes operational, monitoring those security controls. And that brings us to that continuous monitoring requirement that is the opposite of that snapshot in time, sort of legacy perspective where you might revisit the system every 3 years. This is where security controls are looked at on a continuous basis, bringing us back to probably a technology refreshment initiative, or continuing to update the system and continuing around in the loop in the security life cycle. So the first step in that journey is to categorize the system, and looking at the security objectives on the left and what's the potential impact, limited, serious, or severe catastrophic, across those security objectives. So for example, a serious or severe catastrophic adverse effect on the organizational assets for confidentiality, integrity, and availability will determine what the categorization of the system is. Now, sometimes it's looked at as, well, just let's categorize the system and get it over with, and then all is well. Well, this really has a trickle-down effect, because again, it isn't just let's all sign a piece of paper and determine that this is a moderate system, and then we can press on with meeting our schedule. This will drive the selection, implementation, and assessment of the security controls to protect that particular asset. And so that's why this is important, and that's why it's the first step in the process. And security controls is a theme that you hear continuously here, and the reason is because the NIST framework uses that to help drive your then selection and implementation of security controls. And so once you've categorized the system, you then have a set of minimum assurance requirements that you're to meet. And there's that other key word of assurance. And so as the program, the project, the development effort is on its journey, we, much like we can from an IV&V assessment and assurance providing value adding, perform that assessment through the entire life cycle of the security controls themselves, regardless of low, moderate, and high impact systems, and we are indeed doing that on particular missions. To take the security control selection a bit further, these couple slides here help summarize about 400 and some pages of NIST documentation, and that is to show that there are 18 security control families. And if I just use this pointer here, so this is just an example within the access control security family of how, once the system is categorized, then you will take a left or a right, if you will, down your path. Thank you for the assist. For what are your minimum assurance security controls. So obviously a low versus a high is going to have some of the same controls, but a high will have additional what's called enhancements. So if we look at something like account management, you can see that access control 2 and then for low is also in play for moderate and high, but as are other enhancements. And so those are common controls that may be defined by the agency, as well as additional system-specific controls that must be defined, implemented, and tested across a few hundred what become security requirements as they're allocated to a particular system, subsystem, component. And we saw some examples of that yesterday, even in the scoping exercise. This is really more of the gory detail underlying that part of the journey in looking at what should the IV&V project further assess based upon the criticality of the component and its security categorization. So this is that wheel stretched out across the top and overlaid against the acquisition, a generalized acquisition life cycle. So these are some life cycles, life cycle dimensions in order to help also depict the risk management framework tasks as well as the roles. And the real key takeaway here, and again, this summarizes an entire NIST document on the risk management framework. But the idea here is to show that across the life cycle, there are various tasks that must be accomplished. There are inputs and outputs from those tasks, and there are various stakeholders to be satisfied. From a security perspective, it's never simply enough for the mission, just to summarize it to a bumper sticker, the mission shall succeed. Many times that's looked at subjectively. There are objective ways to do that, and there are many adjudicators to tell you whether you're on the right track or not, or that your security controls have some probability of success. And that can be anywhere from the information system owner or data owner themselves determining here are the information types and assets that we're trying to process and protect, all the way through to the risk executive who actually signs on the dotted line and accepts what that risk is. The ultimate goal of all stakeholders should be to help that risk executive make an informed risk-based decision, much like, say, for example, on a NASA mission, whether it be safety or other critical aspects for whether a system is ready to go live, ready to launch, or otherwise. And again, back to reliably, safely, and securely, this is the process across the life cycle that we are able to help with performing those tasks from an independent insurance providing perspective, as well as to satisfy for a variety of stakeholders. So ISSO is Information System Security Officer. You have an ISSE from an engineering perspective. You want to satisfy the information owner, but again, rolling it up to what is the mission objective, what is the business objective, and this can be put into any context. And that's the beauty of the risk management framework. So revisiting IEEE 1012, and to be more specific, quoting from 1012, security analysis throughout is there such that to verify that the system required threat controls and safeguards are correctly implemented, and to validate that they provide the desired levels of protection of system vulnerabilities. So verify and validate. And so it really feeds into what and why I wanted to chat about this today is to help missions gain confidence through standards, through applying the framework and putting it into their context and working backwards, begin with the end in mind to help them cross the finish line and succeed at the mission as it's been defined. We also have here at IV a technical framework, and this is one example to where we explicitly have a step to ensure that security threats and risks are known. So again, documented, well understood, and are the drivers such that then relevant regulatory requirements are identified, and then the rest of the journey can take place. This is a bit of an eye chart, but this is a direct quote also out of IEEE 1012, and some of the highlighted topics should look familiar because they're very life cycle oriented. So you're looking to control threats and exposure to vulnerabilities through the following types of activities: traceability, looking that security requirements are complete and appropriate for the system operational needs. Again, there's that appropriate, adequate aspect, and this helps in negotiating with missions and programs to help define what appropriateness is. Evaluation of the architectures and designs, and the application of verification methods, much like you would do in other target areas of an IV&V analysis or a test exercise, simulations, inspections, demonstrations, and then vulnerability scanning and penetration, which is a fundamental component to examining security posture. So this is revisiting both that acquisition life cycle and the risk management framework at the top, adding the dimension of IV&V structured technical framework. And so this is 1 through 7 mapped across the other dimensions of the life cycle. And then the ovals at the bottom are to show other capabilities around information assurance that could be performed from an independent assessment perspective. So the obvious orange piece in the middle is your IV&V in-phase support. And so that's obviously core capability of the program here. And the point in this case is from the categorization phase that we've discussed all the way through to actively monitoring the security controls, whereas typically IV&V is enabled up through deployment. And we have some examples of where we might continue to do on long-term systems like ISS, where we're continuing to perform IV&V. We are introducing techniques to actually be a part of the monitoring security controls. And don't think of monitoring like Security Operations Center is monitoring and has alerts on particular triggers. This is actively revisiting and examining security controls through the life cycle. That's what NIST means by monitor in this case. And so we're applying techniques to help evaluate those security controls, not just through the development phase, but certainly the implementation test and O&M phase as well. And so the IV&V in phase orange stages, there are information assurance techniques that apply in each of those, and as well as independently through independent assessments, the blue ovals, we're performing independent assessment of, say, security ConOps. So that can be performed both as a full life cycle IV&V, much like other analysis is performed. But in this case, we might find the need to look at what are the business processes. Again, what are the assets being protected or needing to be protected? Do you need a sanity check on exactly what information types are being processed, what interfaces to other trust relationships need to be established? NASA, for example, it has scientific missions and has to share information with academia, with international partners, and that needs to be looked at just even from the business perspective at inception. And then that will have a trickle-down effect as you look at allocation of requirements, how to test those requirements, where to test those requirements in the system. Once you've identified the big picture, and then finding ways to keep it simple, as was mentioned earlier, and bite off chunks of the elephant, so to speak, so that you can navigate through this journey. Some other examples is SRTM is Security Requirements Traceability Matrix. And so depending on the scale and size of the system, even if it's an isolated system with very little connectivity, you're still going to have identified, for example, low security categorization, and therefore a handful of those security control families, their respective low security controls that must be implemented or inherited, or or you're leveraging some other controls that are part of a common system. All that is identified, and the risk is identified, and then that allocation to, say, HWCIs and CSCIs will have a one-to-many-to-many relationship. An independent assessment can be performed simply on just even the requirements phase to determine, is that mature and complete and consistently applied. POAM is Plan of Actions and Milestones, and so an existing legacy system will have been through some element of this process, and deficiencies will have been identified, risk mitigation will be identified, and what is the corrective course of action. And so we can help perform an independent assessment of the POAM, perform the security testing to see if indeed those controls have been implemented properly, securely configured and documented, and therefore the overall security posture of the system is improved. You'll see that show up in a couple places here, both earlier in the selection of security controls to indicate that a legacy system, as it goes through this life cycle process, is revisiting those selections of security controls as they're selecting new enabling technologies or upgrading their technologies or looking to do things better and faster, which doesn't always, as you heard some examples even earlier, isn't always immediately compatible with security, so we have to ensure that the security comes along with those new capabilities. VA and PT, that's the vulnerability assessment and penetration testing, and so you find that in a couple spots here, because where you're implementing security controls and those are assessed, that's where testing occurs. So you may have both from a friendly internal vulnerability assessment as part of your risk assessment strategy, or you may indeed find the need to perform penetration testing where not only are the vulnerabilities identified, but then they're exploited to determine the maturity of your security controls and the configuration of those security controls. Static code analysis, we talked about a good bit about earlier, and you've heard some examples, and these are some of the areas where that fits into these life cycles as well. Now, A&A, that's that assessment and authorization support. That's really across the entire life cycle. And again, not a paperwork exercise. That is to accomplish each of these steps in a very deliberate and intentional way. Now, this isn't just what IV&V performs or what the program performs. This is done in a synergistic approach in order to accomplish the mission. So once the mission's identified, the risks identified, that's well established, and then we work together to, for example, the developer is on the hook to deliver a secure system as identified by the security requirements. And from an independent assessment perspective, we were then helping the program in that role of accepting the product and then ultimately having the agency be able to implement that product into its ground system or into its piece of the flight operation, whatever the example may be. ATO support is the authority to operate. Again, that's not just simply helping package up for the adjudicators to get across the finish line. That's ensuring that security controls do exist, there won't be any surprises, and where you are joining the program and welcoming any scrutiny such that take a look at any of the security controls that are supposed to be there, inviting anyone else to come in with their fine-tooth comb and seek to determine if those security controls are in place and are they securely configured, so that prior to authorizing the system to go live, it's well understood what the risk is, so that that risk executive can accept the risk and make an informed decision to implement the system. Here at IV&V, we have we have our catalog of methods. We have very specific structured entrance and exit criteria. We form a technical reference or have a basis for the decision so that it's a repeatable process. And so even in information assurance, we've identified 5 specific methods that map to the first 5 steps of the risk management framework, which is identified on the left side now, vertically. And the basis for each of those are the Federal Information Processing Standards, or the special pubs from NIST on the far right, as the basis. And then we have a structure that we navigate to help validate or have analysts validate or verify the security controls. Again, not determine whether something has been documented, but to actually help validate and verify the security controls through the life cycle of the system. Then we have instituted vulnerability assessments and penetration testing capabilities to also assess those security controls in the monitoring phase as well as in some of the other phases. I wanted to revisit one of the questions that came up earlier, and I'll go back. So here in this initiation phase and development phases, as well as in the operation and maintenance phase, we talk about IV&V, and we like to be as far into the concept phase as we can be, and typically that IV&V has helped a mission succeed at deployment and then begins to work on other missions. Information assurance, you don't have that luxury of just chopping off the sort of the front and the end of the process, and I already talked about an example with operations and maintenance. But the question was asked about the developer environment. And so beyond just static code analysis, indeed, we are looking at techniques around supply chain, the supply chain management, as well as insider threat to address not only the development environments and the implant security plans and the other aspects around where are the products coming from, where is the development occurring, but also to provide more of an assurance from a risk assessment and vulnerability assessment perspective in that handoff, in that delivery of, you can imagine, large-scale rocketry components, all the way through to the variety of folks, we'll just say, that are working on missions of this complexity and scale. And this isn't unique just to NASA missions, to be concerned about the supply chain and the insider threat perspective. And so, indeed, yes, looking at techniques to address that. So who is really, there's a variety of stakeholders. So it isn't just helping the judge and jury make a decision in adjudicating whether a system is, what the risk level is. It isn't just the program managers so that they can better understand the product and what's being delivered to them. There's also the assessment and accreditation organizations, such that they are making an informed decision with an independent assurance providing view, in addition to the data that's being provided to them by those that are delivering the system or looking to keep the system in use. What assurance? So we talked about that from the beginning, and that's really the product. There are no guarantees. There's no perfect system, and you're trying to then help make a risk-based decision using the data at hand. And that's no different than in some of the other IV&V examples, some of which you've heard here at the workshop, to where you're using the information that's been made available, whether it be artifact review, looking at what code build is available, and you're on a fact-finding mission to then to report on issues to help provide an assurance of what you're seeing. When we talked about various life cycles, and it's throughout the entire life cycle from inception to disposal. Where is everywhere, and don't take the magnifying glass much like the target earlier, as to just be looking down on Earth, because certainly here at NASA we have to be thinking about the security of what's orbiting and out there as well. But where is everywhere? Why? We talked about FSMA. We talked about the threat landscape. Again, play on the Earth icon. It's not so much landscape. It's really just the threatscape, and it's a 360-degree view. And you'll see that theme carries through both from a life cycle perspective as well as location perspective. And so that's the who, what, when, where, why, and the how. I've given some examples, and IV&V works in conjunction with our safety and mission assurance capabilities, our software engineering folks, our chief information officers, both from a headquarters as well as center perspective, and the missions themselves to help them succeed in selecting, implementing, testing security controls throughout the life cycle in order to meet the particular mission objective, and that's the key goal, not simply compliance, but to meet a mission objective. And so it's just some further inspiration, and this is from the SANS Institute. Recently NIST had put out a draft for a security engineering guidelines. The observation here is to build security into the products from the ground up, of course, which has an interesting meaning for an organization like NASA, because it literally is from the ground up. And one of the observations from one of the editors was that organizations continue to remain ill-equipped to implement what's suggested there, despite identifying the threats and designing the requirements into the earliest stages of the life cycle. And thus, back to the point that Congress was reminding NASA of, IV&V is adapting and innovating here at NASA IV&V in order to help organizations and missions succeed and work together to accomplish their mission securely. So, any questions? Yeah, got a comment?
I do have a question
Right.
from online. Don Oe is asking, is there data available on the threat landscape for NASA missions that can be applied to the IV&V planning process? Somebody moved my box. Of risk-based prioritization, such that there can be clear rationale for the amount of IV&V resources should be applied to 1, NASA mission flight systems, and 2, NASA mission ground systems. If so, is that data available in a form that can be efficiently applied in the near term, that is, that the data set would not require a large amount of analysis and interpretation to use it on current IV&V projects?
So the simple answer is yes. There is data available. The second, I think, question, because there was a if yes then, is not exactly. The reason it's not exactly what we could show here, as well as easily or effectively, I think was the question, implementable in the near term, is because of some of the sensitivities. So for example, working with some particular missions to where there are very specific threats that have been identified and requiring certain clearance levels to access those, and that's why I say yes, it's available, and I'll say it depends, such that we can use that information perhaps rolled up, desensitized way to then enable that scoping exercise that Dawn's referring to. So that is something that we're looking to work through. We are plugged in to the threat landscape with various, I'll say, components of both NASA as well as other entities, and it's a matter of making that practical and accessible and actionable is, I think, really what he's asking
I liked what you mentioned about periodically not just looking in, but also reevaluating strategies and requirements, and that instead of the regular maintenance you're used to seeing in security. I guess one of the questions I have, when dealing with your clientele, how do you move them off of almost that snapshot that's a lot. When I encounter clients, a lot of times their thoughts, okay, I have the security, we're a little more simplified, put Norton on and forget about it until next year when it runs out. And how do you drive home? No, this is something we have to be active about, and we have to be sensitive about the settings and our goals and what we're working on. So how do you tend to drive that home with your clients?
Well, in your simple example, that solution is very reactive. To take it to the more broader perspective, it isn't just, well, you should be doing this on a regular basis, and because I say so or because we're told to. That's because the risk is ever changing, the threats continue to evolve, and I think the best way that I approach it is reminding them or helping them remind themselves, what are we trying to protect here? So that's where it depends. You're not going to be able to make too great of a case if it's a low impact system that has very limited interconnects, and you have something that's, say, a low integrity, and they may even have some sacrificial aspect to it that I don't need a contingency plan. I can be down for 30 days and I don't even have funding for a backup site. I'll just rebuild it. To a high system, you can get some attention, not just with the bark and the bite, so to speak, in motivating them, yeah, I do need to be worried about this. And usually what you'll find in a POAM, Plan of Actions and Milestones, is the recognition that we do have a deficiency, but it's going to cost X millions of dollars to fix it. And as long as that's true and not overinflated, to make it just be stalled or be set aside. But you want it to not be an unfunded mandate, so to speak, such that you're motivating the stakeholder to somewhat themselves reassert that, right, because a program manager is, well, my mission's important. Well, then you can't have it both ways. You've got to live up to its importance and how it's been identified, and then that has to flow through in your selection and monitoring of the security control, not just I'll see you in a year. And those more and more are predefined, where you're identifying what security controls are you going to continuously monitor and when, and then the oversight becomes a part of that based upon its importance.
So basically almost a risk-based model like we've looked at in other aspects of the software.
Absolutely.
And then asking those open-ended questions and then be able to, from a mitigation standpoint, attach a dollar value or a hazard value or some kind of value that's going to drive it home to the client. Hey, if we don't do this, possibly this could happen.
Right, and the more it's in their own words, the better.
Better.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I have more of a supportive comment, I guess, and an encouragement for or against the compliance mentality, I suppose. It just, they're no more prevalent example than Home Depot or the year before Target. I would bet they were PCI compliant, lest they were fined and heavily by that for not being, and they received some pretty significant breaches and loss of credit card data, regardless. So if the focus is all on checking boxes, big things can be missed.
And really that's goes to the importance of that, what trust relationships are in place with your interfaces, as well as who your business partners are, where you're sharing the information. And you may be rock solid secure, but if you've opened yourself up to, let's say, other transaction processing, then back to, security, is your weakest link, and that'll bite you.